Hello, thanks for joining us for episode 3 of JRTC's Intel Best Practices. As a part of the Bringing the Crucible to Your Couch, I'm talking to you here from my couch here at Fort Polk, Louisiana. Today's episode is about intelligence preparation of the battlefield, and that you can find in ATP 2-01.3. I'm Colonel John Ives, the Senior Intelligence Officer and Senior Observer Coach Trainer at JRTC. My contact information is located down here at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to reach out at any time. Today we will begin what is actually a two-part of the 4 steps of IPB. Today we'll cover both steps 1 and 2, and then the next episode we'll cover steps 2 and 3. So the 4 steps of IPB. First step, define the operational environment. Second step, discuss the environmental effects on operations. The third step is evaluate the threat. And the fourth step is determine threat courses of action. Now, like I said last time, memorizing ATP 2-01.3 doesn't do you as much good as understanding ATP 2-01.3 or really the 4 steps of IPB. So let's not worry too much about whether or not I misspoke those. They should be located right here while we're talking. What you should see here is straight out of the ATP 2-01.3, which are the example products associated with each step of IPB. The first part I want to discuss are all the example products associated with each step. So you have the 4 steps outlined in this picture, but also all the different products that are kind of expected or anticipated that you'll produce. However, at JRTC, we expect you to provide products that are very much based on what best supports your commander's decision points, what best supports your staff as they complete MDMP, and what best supports your subordinate commanders. So if it doesn't look exactly like it looks in the manual, that's fine. But what we are concerned with is when you skip one of the steps of IPB, don't produce something that's supposed to provide what the event temp provides or doesn't provide what the sit temp provides, and you skip those steps altogether, in which case you end up not supporting your commander or any of those decision points. And here also you have an example inside of ATP 2-01.3 where it explains the inputs and the outputs of IPB, or really part of the MDMP process, and how the outputs of IPB become the inputs of course of action development and course of action comparison. So really, if you're not producing, you're not supporting the entire process. So let's talk about that first point of defining the operational environment. We don't see a whole lot of issues here at JRTC where people come in and they start outlining Alexandria or they're talking about NTC when they're actually at JRTC. We don't have really a big issue with that one of defining the operational environment as far as area of operations, area of interest, giving the general outline of the terrain and the weather. Yes, it's rainy. Yes, it's swampy. Got it. So nobody really has a problem with those. So we're going to move right into step 2. This is where we start to see a real issue with organizations that aren't really paying attention to the products they're putting out. So what are some of the products that come out of this one? Obviously the Makou, obviously weather and light effects. Those are just the 3 basic ones that come out of this portion of it. So let's talk about those. First one, the Makou. The Makou has to support your operation. It has to support your type of organization. And like I said, it has to be able to support your subordinate commanders, staff MDMP, and your commander's decision points or commander's decision process. So really, let me ask you this one. Do you do Makou before you show up at JRTC, or do you do it right when you get there and you receive each mission? I say both. First off, you want to do it ahead of time. Just go ahead and do it for the entire area. You get a general idea of what you have. Then when you get the actual mission, you can dive into that area and redo the Makou for that area. And the reason I say that is when you do all of JRTC, where you're looking at, 20 or 30 kilometers left and right, and then 15 to 20 kilometers north and south, and then you really don't dig into the details. But when you get the actual mission that's coming to you, you might look at it and go, I'm really only concerned with about a 6 or 9 or 10 square kilometer area. Maybe I can just drill into that one and really focus on what it is I'm trying to provide. Plus, you have to imagine that the Makou changes. Yes, the Makou changes based on what's happening inside your operational environment. So for example, let me give you this one. Strikers with an infantry battalion doing an operation. The BCTS2 creates a Makou, hands it down to the striker unit. The next day it rains. and it doesn't rain a little. It rains for 2 days straight. They don't adjust the Makou to talk about the changes in where the water went, whether or not the roads are muddy, whether or not the strikers can even go down the road that they originally planned to do. So what ended up happening is the BCT attacked with strikers down the one part of JRTC that you definitely cannot take heavy vehicles. The entire operation was suffered because nobody updated the Makou and updated that conversation. So the Makou isn't just something you create before you get here, and it's not something that you create at the beginning of MDMP and then don't relook. The Makou is not, you redo it, you do it again, and then you pay attention to it all the way through. The next question we get a lot when it comes to the Makou is whether or not it should be digital or analog. Completely up to you and what it is you like. Personally, I want my geospatial engineer creating some sort of a Makou digitally so that we can look at that one. And then I want to hand it off to somebody who's really good at the Makou and have them do an analog version of one. Give it to one of the soldiers, give it to one of the NCOs, give it to one of your junior officers, and have them run through the Makou. Just really dig into it analog to see where's the difference. And once you've had that person do an analog version, make them your expert on the terrain. Ask them that question every time it starts to rain or it starts to dry up. And you say, wait a minute, if it starts to dry up, are we going to see more dust? Terrain guy, what do you think? And have your terrain person look at it again and go, yeah, I remember this. I had a geospatial engineer tell me, I don't update the Makou once we get to JRTC because, and he said this, with all due respect, terrain doesn't change. And I argue that it does, absolutely does. But if you have a person who's done an analog, they know it. I mean, they got it right up here. They completely understand the impacts of terrain or the impacts of weather on terrain, but also just the different changes in the terrain as it goes as you move through the operations of JRTC. So take a look at that one. The next question we get on Makou is whether or not the Makou is one size fits all. No, it isn't. It absolutely is not. The BCT can do a Makou and get that general idea of what's the entire BCT going to be doing at JRTC, but then you bring in the strikers. Then you bring in the artillery. What about aviation? Think they need a little something different? How about your BSA? The logistics battalions all too often rely on the BCT Makou, or they do one, but it's kind of at the same level as a BCT Makou because they're overly rambunctious about having to do the routes across all of JRTC, which is correct, but it's really not that hard to do, and you could probably count on a geospatial engineer to help you out. So let's be more specific. A logistics S2, say the BSB S2, could be taking a look at this whole thing and say, where are the curves in the road where a fueler or a HEMET is going to have a hard time making that turn? Is there a low water crossing point that is too deep based on the drop where a fueler could actually low bottom or bottom out? Those are the types of questions that a logistics S2 could be asking, but also then when you get closer to the battle and saying, well, we've got tanks, which I'm not used to because I'm an infantry battalion S2 who went to logistics or whatever else it is. I'm not used to this one. Let me ask the question of how much room does a fueler need to turn around? And when's the last turnaround point before they reach the tanks? Just in case the tanks are in contact, I can have them turn around and come back because they're going to get blown up. Or maybe the tanks can meet them at that last turnaround point. That's the type of terrain analysis that a logistics S2 can be doing to support their larger BCT mission, but you really have to think your way through that one. And let's talk about the BSA itself, if you're going to do a Makou for that matter. What's the slope like? And when it rains, is the rain all going to flow down to where you're trying to store up all of your ammo? Or how about your sleeping area? And what about the natural lines of drift when it comes to the defense of your BSA? Because guess what? Geronimo's in the woods, and they're coming after you. It's going to happen every rotation. So just go ahead and figure that out now. If I'm going to set up my perimeter, where's the natural lines of drift? Because humans are humans, and they're going to take the easiest route to get to you, especially when they know BSAs don't do a great job of securing themselves. So here's your opportunity to actually drive that S2. Now let's talk about light and weather. All too often you see a chart that looks like this. If you're looking at this chart right now, what you're seeing is this is just the standard picture that units provide. If you really try to apply some sort of so what to this one, you can look down at the bottom and see the different color schemes for what's going to be affected. A lot of units don't adjust these things to meet exactly what their unit is concerned with when it comes to weather. For example, do the antennas need to be brought down? Do we need to move from the low ground to the high ground based on the rain that's coming? Do we need to be concerned about low water crossing points? A lot of these so whats don't really come up in conversation. Let's zoom in a little bit and look at this light data. The particular unit, who shall not be named, that provided this light data, look at that information about when the sun is rising and when the sun is setting. That doesn't make any sense. The EENT and BMNT, they seem to be flip-flopped. Even if you were to adjust those based on Zulu time to JRTC time, you would find that they don't really match up with sunrise and sunset either. So I'm a little concerned as to what type of data. Now, this particular unit, we went back to them and said, take a look at the data and try to come up with the effects in the hopes that in that coaching they would actually recognize that this was some sort of an issue. It took them almost the entire rotation to find this problem. So I asked the question then, what kind of so what or what kind of value are you providing with your light and weather data if you're not willing to really even take a look at it during IPB? For those of you who have worked with me before, you know I'm much more interested in how to think and not what to think. So when we talk about these things and I say that the ATP 2-01.3 is important for you to review and read and to try and follow it, I'm not so concerned yet again about the products themselves. So I really want you to pay attention to how to think about IPB. So like I said, if you're not thinking about the weather and you're not thinking about the light and how it affects, are you really thinking about the enemy and are you really thinking about the event matrix later on? So let's take this back a notch. Take a look at this light bar example. This is something I used to use as a battalion S2 and have used multiple times in my career. If you start from left to right, what you're looking at is the sun sets and then you have early evening nautical twilight. Then you have a period of darkness before the moon rises. And then you have before morning nautical twilight and then finally sunrise before you have daylight again. This is just a quick visual aid to tell somebody this is what you really have when it comes to light. But here's some key points that people mess up a lot. One, moonrise. First off, the percentage of illume, which I have in here as being 44%, really only talks to the amount of the moon that's visible. That means that this is just under half moon. If you look at where the moon rises as well at 2 something in the morning, it sets sometime in the middle of the day, so it doesn't really do you a whole lot of good to talk about where the moon sets, instead talking about just the moonrise itself. But one thing people don't take into account is where the moon rises. The moon changes from about 64 degrees to about 120 degrees on the horizon, and it adjusts daily throughout the month. If you look at where the moon is rising based on where you are in your operation, you can ask the question of, well, if it's rising at exactly 90 degrees and people facing exactly 90 degrees, maybe that's going to have some sort of an impact on my night vision devices. So where are some great things you can come up with on this one? First off, a light bar like this one can help you drive operations with just the effects of light data. As an example, what direction are we facing? If you happen to be facing the sunset or you happen to be facing the sunrise, are you going to be driving straight into it? And if so, is that going to affect your speed, your spacing? Are you going to have issues being able to see what's going on? So then you have to ask the question, if you're not facing the direction of the sunrise or the sunset, but rather moving the opposite direction, are you being highlighted as you come up over hills? Are your antennas being highlighted? Now here's something, maybe you should mention something about your antennas coming down just as the sun is setting behind them so the enemy doesn't have to just look above the tree line and suddenly see all of your antennas. These are simple things that you can work on and it provides those effects. So what about the moonrise? Like I said, if you're looking into the moon as it's rising, well, you're going to have some sort of an effect up to a certain point. So you kind of have to study the moon. How long does it take the moon to get from edge of the horizon to about, say, 10 or 15 degrees off of horizon, so it's no longer affecting soldiers with their night vision devices, or drivers for that matter? And what about aviation? At some point or another, where the moon rises and where it sets is going to have some sort of an issue for them, just like sunrise and sunset. In that period of darkness that you see on this chart, don't you think people are going to drive and or walk a little bit slower than they will while the moon is up? Plus, think about what it takes to remove and replace the vision blocks on a vehicle. A tank vision block, for example, going from daylight sights to night vision devices, it takes a few moments. This would be a great opportunity to explain to your company commanders or to whoever's paying attention to you of, this is a good place to stop on your route of march, because just as you get to this point, the attack at dawn, for example, maybe you want to change out your sights just a couple of minutes before morning nautical twilight so that your driver already has their daytime sights in. Now you're talking about finding pieces of terrain where you can hide a vehicle to say, change out your sights here so that you're not just sitting on the road exposed to everybody while you're changing out sights. So the same thing for moving from daylight to nighttime. These are issues that you can bring up. So hopefully that provided some sort of an example of how to think, not necessarily what to think, based on your mission, based on your requirements of what your unit has, what's special to them that light, weather, or the terrain will impact. And when you combine those together, say moving uphill into the sunrise, that starts to change the mathematics of how the unit's going to move when they're going to move. And you can actually drive operations using something as simple as that to say, you can't be speeding into the sunset. It's not going to work for you. This is where you need to take a short halt. Have those types of conversations with your team. And don't forget the things like humidity, where the dew point is, because maybe you don't want your infantry down on the low ground just as the nighttime reaches dew point. Everybody's going to wake up wet and miserable. Maybe you could talk to them about moving up the hill a little bit or covering all of their equipment with a poncho just at dew point so they can remove it right afterwards, and then they still have dry equipment and dry clothes for that matter. These things will make a huge difference in the battle, and that's where you come into play. Hey, thanks for joining us for episode 3. We talked about 2 steps of IPB, describing the operational environment and describing the effects on the operations. Please take a look at these things, consider them, think about how they impact you, and of course, take a look at 2-01.3. You can also find that on the Google, and please feel free to contact me via the information here below, and I look forward to hearing from you. Be safe, be smart, and wash your hands.